All right, so in this video, we're going to pick up where we left off last time. So last time we were talking about the vertebral column, and we talked about intervertebral discs. So now we're going to continue talking about the vertebral column. So with the vertebral column, you can see it's curved, right? It has kind of this like wavy curve to it, all right, like that. And so those curves, you're not born with them. They develop as you do certain activities, right, as a baby. And so let's talk about how that happens. So the primary curves of the spine, all right, are the thoracic and sacral curves. So when you're born, your spine essentially has a C shape to it, okay? And so it's curved convex anteriorly. So that means from the front, concave. So from the front, it's concave. So you naturally have this kind of C-shaped spine like this, all right? And so the remnants of that are the thoracic region, which has that shape, and the sacral region here. So those two curves are the same curves that were present at birth, all right? So a baby's spine has a concave, anteriorly curved spine like that. So those are the primary curves. The secondary curves develop as the baby starts to perform different tasks, all right? So the first one is going to be the cervical curve and then the lumbar curve. So the cervical curve develops, so this is convex, right? It moves kind of forward anteriorly like this. And that comes from when the baby holds their own head up, right? So when they're starting to support the weight of their head and use those muscles, you get this curvature of the spine, all right? So this cervical curve, okay? And then the lumbar curve here develops when the baby starts to stand and walk, okay? So as the baby starts to use those muscles, put weight on the spine from standing and walking around, this lumbar curve develops, all right? So those are secondary curves, right? Because they're not, you're not born with them. Okay, so primary curves and secondary curves. And then I'm sure you're aware there are irregular curvatures to the spine. So the spine can develop irregular curvatures, and you should know 3 of them. The first one is lordosis. And so lordosis is an exaggerated curve of the lumbar spine. All right, so this is lumbar. And so all spines should have a certain degree of lordosis, but it can become drastic and exaggerated, all right? And that's when it might become a medical concern, all right? So lordosis would be an exaggerated curvature of the lumbar spine, okay? And then kyphosis, all right, you can see here, that's kind of a hunchback curvature of the spine, all right? So she has an exaggerated curvature of the thoracic region, all right? So this would affect the thoracic portion of the vertebral column. All right, that's kyphosis. So kyphosis would be someone who's hunchback. A lot of times, lordosis is referred to as swayback, all right? So with the lumbar spine. So swayback, hunchback, and then you have scoliosis. And so scoliosis is a curvature of the spine that is not in line with the regular curves, right? So it's going more left to right, not anterior and posterior. So it's a curvature of the spine in this way, all right? So that's scoliosis. Okay, so now let's talk about the shape of each vertebrae and how they kind of fit together with each other, okay? And so with the vertebrae, and we mentioned before, right, so the word for a hole in a bone is a foramen. Plural of that is foramina. So we're going to talk about the foramina associated with the vertebrae. All right. And so the first one that's really important, if you see a vertebrae, there's going to be a large hole here. All right, this is the vertebral foramen. It goes down the middle of that vertebrae, all right? You can actually see it here on this particular vertebrae, right? So it's a very large hole. The purpose of that vertebral foramen, All right, we'll write that here. Vertebral foramen is the big hole in the middle of the vertebrae, and it is for the spinal cord. That's what the spinal cord passes through. All right, so that's for the spinal cord. Okay, so that's the first thing. And so then the other really important foramen that you should know comes when you put the vertebrae together and when they articulate with each other. So we can see that here on this picture. So when we have our vertebrae stacked, all right, on top of each other, you can see that there's a hole that forms between them, all right, here, okay? And this is called an intervertebral foramen. Okay, so intervertebral, meaning between the vertebrae, intervertebral foramen. Okay, and so this is the hole through which nerves leaving the spinal cord will pass. And so those are called spinal nerves. All right, so spinal nerves leave through those holes, and then they can go out to whatever part of the body that they need to. Okay, and so you can actually see that here, right? So we have the spinal cord. This would be a spinal nerve here, right? And another one here, leaving through that intervertebral foramen. Okay, so those are two really important foramen for the spinal column, right? The vertebral column, the vertebrae. And you'll learn some others in lab. There's actually we'll talk about it here in just a second. There's a couple others that are important when you're trying to identify different vertebrae. Okay, so now let's talk about what the different types of vertebrae, so cervical, thoracic, and lumbar, are gonna look like. Okay, and so the first thing to point out is that the first two vertebrae are very special. All right, so C1, which you can see, whoops, switch to the pen, here, right? So we have C1, and then just below it here, we have C2. Okay, so C1 and C2 are special, and they actually are the only vertebrae that are given a special name aside from being just called C1 and C2. So C1 is called the atlas. All right, and it's special because it attaches the vertebral column to the skull. All right, so it articulates with the occipital bone. Okay, and so the occipital bone would sit, there's like these little kind of holders, right? So typically areas where joints are formed are nice and smooth and sometimes kind of cup-shaped, and those are called condyles. You'll learn about that in lab. All right, so it has these condyles, these kind of joint-forming surfaces where that occipital bone will sit. And so I'm going to scroll up to our picture of the skull really quick, just so we can see kind of the matching part on the skull, right? So we have here on our skull, this brown bone is the occipital bone. It has these matching pieces, almost like a little puzzle piece that fits, right? So those are going to sit on those condyles on the atlas, okay? So it got its name, the atlas, from, I don't know if you've seen that statue. It's in New York of the man holding up the world. It's also, I think it's Greek, maybe, mythology, right? Atlas holds up the world on his shoulders. And so that's where it got its name, because it's this little bone that holds up the entire skull. So it's called the atlas, all right? And then the bone directly underneath it, C2, is called the axis. Okay. All right. And so the axis is called that because it has this little part, and you can see it here. All right. So if this is our axis vertebrae, all right, it actually has this little part that sticks up. All right. That is the axis, right? So it has this little nub sticking up. And what happens is that this C1 can rotate left to right, right? So it allows you to be able to say no, right? To shake your head no, back and forth, okay? So it allows for a pivot kind of motion. All right, so that would be like no, okay? That's why it's called the axis, right? Because like think of the earth turning on its axis, right? So this would be the C1 rotating on the axis. Okay, and the occipital bone articulating with the atlas, so the joint between these two, this functions kind of as a little cradle, all right, these guys. And so they actually allow movement back and forth, right? Like kind of almost a rocking movement. And that's what the movement you would make if you were saying yes. All right. So the joint, if we were kind of to put this into words, the joint or the articulation between C1, all right, and the occipital bone allows you to say yes or nod your head. The articulation between C2 and C1 allows you to say no or move your head left to right. Okay, so those are two special bones. They're the only ones that have their own special name. And when you're in lab, you should probably, it depends on your structure, but you'll probably learn to identify them specifically, those two bones. And then aside from that, you need to be able to differentiate a cervical bone from a thoracic from a lumbar. You certainly don't need to know lumbar number 5 from lumbar number 1, all right? You just need to know it's a lumbar vertebrae. So let's talk about that really quick. Okay, so I've got one of each here. So this would be a cervical vertebrae, this would be a thoracic, and this would be a lumbar. All right, so actually this cervical vertebrae specifically, and I don't know why this was the only one they had a decent picture of in your textbook, but this is C1. Okay, so we're looking at C1, but it shows us the features that we need to talk about. All right, so with the cervical vertebrae, I think they're the easiest to identify because they have 3 holes versus all the other vertebrae only have that one big vertebral foramen in the middle. So they have that vertebral foramen, all right, here, and then they also have these holes off to the side called transverse foramina. All right, so these are transverse foramen. That is a transverse foramina, or they are transverse foramina, all right? And so cervical vertebrae all have those transverse foramina, okay? So that makes them very easy to identify. Thoracic is not going to have that. Lumbar is not going to have that. So if you see a bone and you see 3 holes, one in the middle and then one off on either side, that's a cervical vertebrae, okay? And then another way to tell, and it's not going to be super easy to see in all of these pictures, but the vertebral foramen on this guy is very round. It's nice and round, all right? And that's going to differ in the other vertebrae we look at. Okay, so then our thoracic vertebrae, all right, that's this guy. I always remember this because it looks like a giraffe. All right, so it kind of has like a giraffe look to it. They're smaller than the lumbar vertebrae. All right, so we have like our giraffe nose here with its little ears and its little kind of antler type things that are on top of its head. All right, so this is our giraffe vertebrae. Okay, and if we were to look kind of top down like this at this vertebrae, that vertebral foramen is going to kind of have this like triangle shape to it. Okay, so that might help you in lab. All right, so the vertebral foramen is a little more triangular. It's not nice and round like the cervical vertebrae. All right, so that's thoracic. And then we have lumbar. These are the big, chunky vertebrae. All right, because they have to withstand all that weight. They're at the bottom of the vertebral column. Okay, and so they look like a moose. All right, so lumbar is the moose vertebrae. So we have our big moose nose. All right, we have our big antlers. Okay, for our moose. Thoracic is the giraffe, all right? And then for the lumbar, that vertebral foramen goes back to being nice and round, okay? So triangular is only for the thoracic. Okay, so that's kind of a couple of ways that I find the easiest to tell them apart. Your book, and especially your lab manual, has a bunch of other ways that you can tell them apart. But I think those, if you can kind of remember those couple of ways, those are the easiest to use. Okay, so those are our types of vertebrae. All right, and so some questions I could ask you about the vertebrae is how like which vertebrae articulate with which. So if, for example, I asked lumbar vertebrae or L2, all right? So L2 articulates with which bone inferiorly? Okay, so you think, well, we have L2, inferior means on the bottom, all right? So inferiorly, L2 would articulate with L3, all right? Because that's what's going to be below L2. Okay, so it'd be questions like that. Nothing super complicated. We could specifically ask you, C1 articulates with what bone superiorly, all right? So that means on the top, and so that would be the occipital bone. If I asked inferiorly, all right, that would be C2 or the axis, okay? So those would be the types of questions that we could ask about that. All right, so now at the base of the vertebral column, L5, right? So let's say if this were L5 and I asked what this bone articulates with inferiorly, L5, the bottom of it, is going to articulate with the top of the sacrum. Okay, so that's what this guy is. So this is the sacrum, and it articulates with the last lumbar vertebrae. All right. Okay, and so then we'll see in just a minute when we talk about the appendicular skeleton, it's going to articulate on the bottom with this sacrum. All right, so your hip bones would attach to your pelvic bones, would attach to the sides of the sacrum here. And then, so we have our sacrum, and then we have the coccyx here, which is the tailbone. All right. Okay. And so then lastly, for our axial skeleton, we have ribs. All right. So the ribs are attached again to thoracic vertebrae. All right. So they articulate with the thoracic vertebrae. And then they can, to varying degrees, attach to the sternum. Okay, so we have our sternum here, all right, in the middle. This is the sternum. The sternum has 3 different parts, all right. And so we have on the top here, we have the manubrium, all right. And then we have the body. And then at the very bottom, it kind of comes to a point that is called the xiphoid process. Okay, so then all together, those 3 parts make up the sternum. All right, and so the ribs attach to the sternum, most of them, not all of them, attach to the sternum, and they're attached by cartilage. And remember, this is called costal cartilage. Okay, and that costal cartilage is made of hyaline cartilage. All right, so it's hyaline cartilage. Okay, good. All right, and so then the different types of ribs, they're kind of named just based on how they attach to the sternum. All right, so you can see some of the ribs, like this top one, just directly comes from the vertebrae in the back around and directly attaches all by itself to the sternum. All right, so it just has its own special dedicated connection to the sternum. So that is called a true rib. All right, and so there are 7 true ribs. Okay, so that's an example of this. True ribs have their own single piece of cartilage that goes to the sternum. So you have 7 true ribs, and then you have 3 false ribs. Okay, so false ribs share cartilage. All right. So if they had asked me when they were naming these, I would have said there are 4 false ribs, but remember there's 3, all right? So it's 1, 2, 3. I would have also said this is a false rib because it's sharing cartilage with these other 3, but that's not the case, right? This is kind of its cartilage, and the false ribs are like piggybacking with it, okay? So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 true ribs. Then 1, 2, 3 false ribs that share this cartilage. They all join together like this. And then they piggyback onto that last true rib to meet the sternum. All right, and then lastly, there are 2 floating ribs. All right, so these are floating. They do not connect to the sternum at all. All right, so floating ribs. Whoops, we forgot to put 3 here and 2 here. And I do want to specify, all right, when I say there's 7 true ribs, there's 7 pairs of true ribs. So you would have your first true rib, so 1, and then its counterpart on the other side, and then 2, and then 3, and so on. So there's 7 pairs of true ribs, there's 3 pairs of false ribs, and there's 2 pairs of floating ribs, okay? Because you always have a left and a right rib. All right, and so then this picture over here is just showing how the ribs connect to the vertebrae. All right, so then in the back, they connect kind of to on the superior aspect, right, of the vertebrae. So there would be another rib attached here to this vertebrae. Okay, and those are going to be all thoracic vertebrae for the 12 total ribs, each attaching to one of the 12 thoracic vertebrae. Okay, so that's it for the axial skeleton. So let's talk about the appendicular skeleton. All right, so remember, these are going to be the limbs. Okay, so the arms and the legs. So we're going to start with the arms. So we're going to start with the superior aspect of the appendicular skeleton. All right, so this is where we're going to point out specifically where appendicular and axial meet. Okay, so superiorly, the appendicular and axial skeletons meet here. All right, so this is one meeting point. Okay, and so that is between this bone, which is the sternum. So specifically the manubrium of the sternum. If I just ask you for bone, you can say sternum. All right, and then here with the clavicle. Okay, so superiorly, the appendicular and axial skeleton meet at the articulation between the clavicle and the sternum. Okay, so where this clavicle, it's this whole bone, your collarbone, meets the breastbone, the sternum, that is the joint between appendicular and axial skeleton. So you would have one on the right side and you would have another one on the left side here. Okay, so then let's kind of talk about what other bones are attached. All right, and so we have our clavicle is going to articulate with the shoulder blade. So that is called the scapula. All right, so this is the scapula here. This is the scapula. That's the shoulder blade, and it attaches to the point of the shoulder blade that makes up the point of your shoulder. If you remember from your regional terms, the point of the shoulder is called the acromial region. All right, and so nicely, this part of the scapula is called the acromion. All right, so it's the acromion of the scapula. And so in lab, you're going to learn a lot of these bones. So the whole bone is called the scapula. They have other parts. So they're called bone markings. So we talked about foramen, that's a bone marking. It'll have maybe a process, which is kind of like a protrusion. It could have an indentation called a fossa. So they all get names, and you'll be learning a lot of those. One of them you'll learn is this one, right? So the acromion of the scapula. That's where the clavicle attaches, all right? And then the clavicle, or sorry, the scapula, all right, actually it has kind of this triangular shape to it, all right? So this is the scapula here. That's your shoulder blade, okay? So that would be kind of the bottom point of your shoulder blade that you may be able to see, right, if you move your arm in a certain way on your back. And the scapula, interestingly, does not articulate with the ribs at all. It kind of just floats on the surface of the ribs back here on your back. So that's why if if you've ever been in a car accident or you know someone who has, and you put your hands straight out in front of you, maybe against the steering wheel, what's going to happen is the force from that accident, right? It's going to push on your humerus that's extended out, all right? That is going to push back your scapula, all right, which is not attached to anything, is going to push back from away from your ribs. All right, it's just muscles kind of holding it in place. So it's going to push back. And so typically with those car accidents, you will see a broken collarbone because you do have an articulation here. That scapula is moving back and it's going to pull on this collarbone and that's going to break it. So a lot of times you'll see that. And that is because, there we go. That's because that scapula doesn't articulate with the rib cage. So when the force pushes it back, it can just move backwards, but the clavicle doesn't have that option, so it ends up breaking. All right. So then laterally, all right, so if we're talking about the clavicle, medially it articulates with the sternum, laterally it articulates with the scapula. The scapula does not articulate with the ribs, but it does also articulate with our first arm bone, and that's the humerus. All right, so we have a nice ball and socket joint here between the scapula and the humerus. All right, so humerus, okay, is here and here. All right, and you'll learn a lot of parts of the humerus, right? You'll learn like these two bumps have names. Those are where certain muscles attach. The scapula has this kind of, it's almost like a cup. You can kind of see the edge of it here that the humerus fits into. That is called the glenoid fossa. Or sometimes you can see it's called cavity. All right. And so that is what the humerus fits into. Okay. So we would say proximally, all right, the humerus articulates with the scapula. All right. So then let's look distally. So if this is our humerus, all right, we have our ball part here that fits into the scapula. So that's proximal. The distal end of our humerus here is going to articulate with the radius and the ulna. Okay. And so we can see, so here, all right, so this would be, there we go. This would be the ulna, all right, and this would be the radius. Okay, and so we've kind of just zoomed in on the end here. Now we have the radius and the ulna attached, all right, and so they're attached just like this, right? So we're just looking at the top of this attached to the bottom of this. Okay, and so you can kind of see the little edge of the ulna here, and the little top of the radius here is the edge of the ulna here, and the top of the radius here. Okay, and so they kind of hook on, the ulna itself actually has this kind of like U-shaped, U for ulna, cup that like latches around the bottom of the humerus, and that forms that hinge joint that's your elbow. Okay. So you have your radius and your ulna attached at the distal end of the humerus. All right. Then if we follow the radius and the ulna down to their proximal end, they are going to articulate with the carpals. All right. And so you should be familiar with the names of the carpals here. Okay. So these are the carpals. So your wrist bones. You're not going to have to label any of the carpals for lecture. The one that you might want to know, all right, is that the distal end of the radius here articulates with one of the biggest carpal bones here called the scaphoid. Okay, so this radius sits right on top of that scaphoid. And so a lot of times, if you have certain injuries associated with the radius, right, like maybe you fall to catch yourself, you could break your radius, and you could also damage your scaphoid because they are kind of stacked on top of each other. All right, so this is scaphoid. All right, aside from that, I'm not going to label all of the individual carpal bones. Make sure you're familiar with the names. You should already be learning them probably for lab. All right, if not, just learn the names, be familiar with them, be able to tell the name of a carpal bone from a tarsal bone, which is your ankle bones. All right, but I'm not going to have you label a picture of the wrist or anything like that. Okay, so then we go from our carpal bones to our metacarpals. All right, so the carpal bones articulate distally with the metacarpals. All right, that's these. So those make up the palm of your hand. All right, so metacarpal. All right, and so when we are talking about a specific metacarpal, we use Roman numerals. All right, and so you always start with number 1 being the thumb. Okay, so Roman numerals, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so if you're talking about metacarpal 1, all right, that would be this metacarpal here. Okay, metacarpal 3 would be this metacarpal here. All right, so we number them. We use that same numbering system for the next set of bones, which are going to be the phalanges. All right, so the phalanges, all right, and just so we're familiar, the singular for phalanges is phalanx. All right, so you would have 1 phalanx, right? So this would be a single phalanx, or all 3 of these, you'd have 3 phalanges. Okay, so phalanges, plural, phalanx, singular. All right, and you have either proximal, middle, all right, or distal. That's how we name them. Okay, so this would be proximal, closest to the metacarpals. This would be middle. All right, and this little one, the very tip of the finger, is distal. And then the thumb is only going to have proximal and distal. All right, whoops, that's our metacarpal. Proximal and distal. There we go. All right, so if I asked you middle, so let's see, the proximal end of middle phalanx 2 articulates with what bone? All right, you would find middle phalanx 2, that would be this one. All right, the proximal end would be this end. So it's articulating with proximal phalanx number 2. So that would be the ancillary. So it articulates with proximal phalanx 2. Okay, so those would be the kind of questions we could ask. So you need to, even though you're not going to be labeling anything like a picture like this on your exam, you need to have a visual kind of image in your head of this picture. All right, so then you can just imagine it when you're taking your exam. Imagine, okay, well, I see that's where that bone is. That's the proximal end, so it's attached to this bone. Okay, so practicing labeling these will help you, even though you're not actually going to be doing any labeling on your exam. All right, so that's the hand. So we've done the arm, all right, and the hand. So now let's move on to the lower extremities. Okay, so first of all, where does the appendicular meet the axial skeleton posterior or inferiorly? Sorry, inferiorly. So on the bottom, inferiorly, all right, it articulates with the, remember this is the sacrum, all right, and the pelvic bones, which are called the os coxae. Okay, so this specifically, all right, is the joint posteriorly between the axial and appendicular skeleton. So we'll label those 2 bones that form that joint. All right, that's the sacrum, which we've talked about. And then this bone, the whole bone, is called the os coxae, or I think more recently it's now being called the coxal bone, which is certainly easier to spell, right? You guys are welcome to use either one. It's up to you. Okay, and so you have 2 of those. You have a left and a right os coxae. So you have your left os coxae, right? That's goes all the way to the front. So this whole thing, and you have the right os coxae. Okay, and so they meet here in the middle anteriorly. This is called the pubic symphysis. And we talked about this with our cartilage section on tissues because it's made up of fibrocartilage. All right, so that is where the two coxal bones, the os coxae, attach anteriorly. Posteriorly, they meet at the sacrum. All right, and so if we're looking at these coxal bones, all right, so we have one isolated here, and then it's just kind of rotated here. This surface is where it attaches to the sacrum. So this surface is this surface here where it's touching the sacrum. Okay, and you can kind of see like this hole here is this hole here. Okay, so that's where the axial and appendicular skeleton meet inferiorly. All right, so now let's talk about that os coxae, that bone. So it's made up of 3 separate kind of bones that end up fusing together. And so I like this picture here because it's color coded. All right, and so you can kind of see where each bone is because there's no real line on the os coxae distinguishing between each bone once they've completely fused together. All right, so we have the big part of the os coxae is the ilium. All right, and so a lot of terms associated with this, so the different structures you'll learn, it has like all these little points and stuff like that, right? And this big crest, right? It's called the iliac crest. So iliac is a lot of the structures on the ilium. All right, so that's this whole part here. So if we're looking at the actual hip kind of bone, the os coxae in place, right, that would be all of this big kind of hip bone here. Okay, so it's all that part, right? You can actually touch your hip bone on the sides of your hips. That's all part of the ilium. All right, and so then you have the part you sit on, right? That is the ischium. Okay, so the ischium is kind of the seat bone, the butt bone part of the pelvis, right? So this is actually the part kind of that forms the seat, all right? And it would actually have, it's usually when you see roughness, right? So if we kind of zoom in, see how this is kind of rough, right? When you see that on a bone, typically that's going to be where muscles attach. So you do have lots of muscles that attach there. Okay. All right, and then lastly we have the front part, right? So this is where that pubic symphysis would be, right? So this part is this part here, okay? And so the red, this whole thing, is the pubis. Okay, so you have the pubis, the ilium, and the ischium make up the entire os coxae. Those are the 3 parts. All right, and then the one other thing to point out, because you can see it really well in this picture, is the ball for the ball and socket, or sorry, the socket for the ball and socket joint of our hip, right? So where the hip meets the femur. So this socket here is where that femur fits in, and this is called the acetabulum. All right, so it's the nice kind of open socket that femur fits into. And so actually the head of the femur here, right, would just fit right into that acetabulum. All right, and so it's located, we can just kind of see it slightly from the side here, right there. Okay, so that femur would fit into the acetabulum there. All right, okay, so then the femur is going to articulate proximally with the os coxae, right? And if we're being more specific, it's the acetabulum of the os coxae. If I ask you just for bone, you can tell me os coxae or coxal bone. Okay? So then again, the femur, you're going to learn lots of parts, right? This is the head, right? The neck. You have all these, bumps and stuff called trochanters. There's points where different muscles attach that you'll learn. All right, and then if we go to the distal end of the femur down here, it is going to articulate with the tibia. All right, so there's kind of like these 2 bumps here that are going to match up with the little indentations, the little sockets here on the tibia. Okay, so the distal end of the femur articulates with the tibia, but not the fibula. Okay, so this is the tibia. All right. This is the fibula, and you can see the proximal end, this end of the fibula, actually attaches to the side of the tibia, not to the femur. All right, and so you may come across the question in your review, what two bones does the distal end of the femur attach to? So it attaches to the tibia, all right, and then it also articulates with the patella, which is not shown here. I'll just scroll up to that first kind of page that we looked at. Give me a second. I should have included it. There we go. All right, and so you can see here. So the distal end of the femur articulates with the tibia and the patella. So those are the two bones. All right, but it does not articulate with the fibula. All right, back down to our picture. Okay. All right, and so then the tibia, right? We go down to the distal end. It's going to articulate with the fibula, all right? And actually something interesting, right, to think about, if you reach down and touch your ankle, right, what we call your ankle, kind of on the medial side and the lateral side, those are not actually ankle bones, all right? Those are these structures here. So these are called, right, each one is going to be a malleolus. I actually don't know the plural of a malleolus. Malleoluses? I don't know. So this is a malleolus. All right, and those are actually what you are feeling when you touch what we call the ankle. So it's actually part of the fibula and the tibia. Okay, it's not one of the actual tarsal bones. All right, so then this part of the tibia sits directly on top of this first tarsal bone here. All right, so this is called the talus. Okay, so it's important to know the major tarsal bone that tibia articulates with. So it sits down directly on top of the talus. All right, so like this little notch here, that little malleolus comes off of the side here of the talus. Okay, and you should be familiar with the other names of the tarsal bones. One of them you probably already learned when you learned the regional term for the heel, which was calcaneal. The heel bone, that bone is called the calcaneus. All right, so you kind of already know that. You learn the other ones, just be familiar with the names again. You don't have to know and be able to identify specifically where they are, right? You've got cuneiforms, navicular, cuboid, that kind of thing. Okay, then the other bones of the foot are gonna be named exactly like what we talked about with the hand. All right, so we have, instead of metacarpals here, we have metatarsals. All right, so these are metatarsals. No reason to make that capital. Let's try that again. All right, metatarsals. And so you start with the big toe is number 1, number 2, number 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so we have our metatarsals, which are each of these. They're attached to the phalanges. Again, that's going to be proximal, middle, distal. And then the big toe, the hallux, all right, only has proximal and distal. All right, so just like the hand. Okay, and so I could ask you similar questions as we talked about for the hand. All right, so that's it for the bone section. Again, this takes mostly a lot of review and familiarizing yourself with the bones, how they're attached to each other, and that kind of thing. And so I think practicing labeling does help, so you can kind of have a visual of the skull, right, when you are, taking your exam. Okay, but you just have it in your head, right? Be able to visualize, the skull, the skeleton, the feet, the hands, and how those bones fit together, just from memory. All right. So then the next chapter, we are going to talk about articulations. So what holds the bones together, the different types of joints, and how they're held together.